Okay, so in my research, I focused on finding new ways to advance the conservation of prairie dogs that would be positive for ranchers. Prairie dogs are an ecologically important species in the Great Plains ecosystem, but ranchers view them as a competitor with cattle. The ranching industry is very powerful. It brings in over $40 billion in the US and uses over 2/3 of the Great Plains. Before I get into my research, I'm going to give you some background information so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. The Great Plains are a vast expanse of treeless grassland. They are home to iconic American species such as bison and prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are burrowing ground squirrels, starting at the top, that live in colonies that make up colony complexes. There are 5 species of prairie dogs, but the species I'm going to talk about today is the black-tailed prairie dog. Prairie dogs create a unique ecosystem which many other species depend on for survival. While this diagram may look complicated, the important thing to realize is that prairie dogs change the ecosystem in 3 ways. They dig burrows, they keep the grass short, and they serve as prey. Prairie dogs are considered a keystone species. Just like the center stone of an arch that holds up all the other stones, if you take the prairie dog out, the other stones will fall. When Europeans began settling the West in the early 1900s, many of them took up ranching. They viewed prairie dogs as a competitor with cattle and classified them as an agricultural pest. Over the next 60 years, extensive efforts were made to eradicate the prairie dog. By the 1960s, only 2% of their former inhabited area remained. Also in the 1960s was a new environmental movement. This group of people viewed the loss of the prairie dog as a loss of a species important to an entire ecosystem. Their viewpoints contradicted those of the ranchers, and a conflict arose that still exists to this day. One of the species that is part of the prairie dog ecosystem is the black-footed ferret. It is an endangered species because there are not enough prairie dogs on the landscape to support their recovery. Conservation efforts of the prairie dog have been unsuccessful to this day. Today, reintroductions of ferrets are used to protect the remaining prairie dog habitat on the landscape. But the whole conservation effort is at a standstill. We can't recover the ferret because there aren't enough prairie dog colonies. And there aren't enough prairie dog colonies because there's not enough support for their restoration. For my research, I wanted to know how to move prairie dog conservation forward. A review of the literature showed that we had a good understanding of the biological and ecological aspects of prairie dogs. We also had a pretty good understanding of ranchers' perceptions and attitudes towards prairie dogs. What we didn't know about was how the ranchers associated with prairie dogs themselves. After all, they were the ones who had control of the land, and they were the ones who decided if prairie dogs on their land lived or died. I decided to try to figure out how to advance the conservation of prairie dogs that would be acceptable to ranchers. My research was motivated by 3 main questions. What motivates ranchers? How can we advance the conservation of prairie dogs with ranchers? And what are the next best steps for prairie dog conservation? I used quantitative and qualitative methods to answer these questions. I conducted semi-structured interviews with stakeholders. I asked ranchers about their operations, how they made decisions about their operations, and their viewpoints on ranching and conservation. I analyzed the data with 1 and 2 sample t-tests and best subsets and regular regression. In total, I conducted 48 interviews. Of those, 28 were with ranchers. Those ranchers controlled over 1 million acres in eastern Colorado. Those ranchers also owned over 15,000 cows. Of all the ranchers I spoke with, most of them did not like prairie dogs. Most of them believed that prairie dogs are bad for the land and definitely did not want any more of them. In order to answer my first research question, I asked ranchers about their operations. I wanted to find out what types of methods they used on their ranch and what issues they focused their attention on. I put all of these issues into an overarching category called ranchers' viewpoints. All but 1 rancher believed that prairie dogs competed with cattle. This is important because even as recently as last year, studies had shown that the net effects of prairie dogs is usually neutral on cattle weight gains. Another key issue that came up is how much attention ranchers give to the weather. 93% of the ranchers I spoke with were concerned with drought. The weather is something that is out of their control, but that the success of their ranch depends on it. This puts them in a powerless situation. When it came down to why ranchers chose to ranch, I distilled the results into two categories: ranching for a lifestyle and ranching as a business. Only 50% of the ranchers I spoke with said they were ranching to make a profit, whereas 96% said they were ranching for a lifestyle. In support of this idea, I found that 61% of the ranchers supported their lifestyle with sources of income off the ranch, and 52% diversified their income sources on their ranches. This is important because some conservationists believe that ranchers are just in it for the money. My results show the opposite, and in fact, many of the ranchers I spoke with told me that they were operating at a financial loss. So to answer my first research question of what motivates ranchers, when you combine the financial constraints that ranchers experience with the powerless feeling ranchers have being at the mercy of the weather, and their belief that prairie dogs compete with cattle, it makes sense that ranchers would try to eradicate prairie dogs on their ranch in order to preserve their vocation. I wanted to know more about how ranchers made their decisions. How did they decide when and where to move their cattle? How did they decide when and how much to poison prairie dogs? 71% of the ranchers I spoke with said that finances influenced their ranch operations. About 2/3 said morals, law, and previous practices influenced their operations, and only 32% credited science. In a follow-up survey, I asked ranchers to give each of these factors a percentage based on the weight of influence on their decisions about grazing plans and prairie dog management. I received results from 20 ranchers. These are the raw results. I'll show you these so you can see that there are some anomalies. For instance, 2 of the ranchers on this graph allocated 100% to finance and science each. When considering prairie dog management, again, you can see some anomalies. In order to find out how this set of ranchers made decisions as a group, and if they made decisions for the 2 issues in different ways, I took the average of their responses and compared the change in percent for these 2 issues. If ranchers create grazing plans and manage prairie dogs in order to improve cattle outcomes, you would expect the allocation to be the same. But this is not what I found. The results are really interesting. The decisions ranchers made about the 2 issues differed in 3 main ways. Science significantly influenced ranchers' decisions about grazing more than prairie dog management. So did previous practices. But the decisions about prairie dog management were more influenced by finances than the decisions about grazing plans. With this information, we can start to answer my second research question. How can we advance the conservation of prairie dogs that would be positive for ranchers? These results suggest that when talking to ranchers about their grazing plans, we should frame things in terms of science and previous practices. But when talking to ranchers about prairie dog management, we should frame things in terms of finance. To further find out how to advance the conservation of prairie dogs, I looked to see if I could statistically predict ranchers' perceptions of prairie dogs with some of the information I collected during the interviews. I tried several regression models and many variables to derive a best fit model. With a sample size of 26, I found that the best model included the variables of ranchers who were concerned with drought and ranchers who favored wildlife control. The ranchers who were concerned with drought had a lower perception of prairie dogs by 1.67, whereas the ranchers who weren't, or compared to those who didn't, and the ranchers who favored wildlife control had a lower perception of prairie dogs by 1.9. The R-squared value for this is 65.5%, explaining 65% of the variability in the perception of prairie dogs can be explained by these 2 variables. But what does this mean for advancing the conservation of prairie dogs with ranchers? Well, ranchers who are concerned with the lack of rain and ranchers who favor wildlife control may already feel like they are on a financial edge. These ranchers may view prairie dogs as an additional financial burden. It could be that they eliminate prairie dogs on their land because it's one of the only things they feel that they have control over. But this still doesn't answer the question. How can we advance the conservation of prairie dogs, especially knowing that 93% of the ranchers I spoke with are concerned with drought? I ranked ranchers' perceptions of prairie dogs on a 5-point scale, 1 being that they hate prairie dogs, and 5 being that they love prairie dogs. I found that ranchers who focused on the ecological health of their land had a higher mean perception towards prairie dogs. I also found the ranchers who favored wildlife control had a lower mean perception towards prairie dogs. So this suggests that conservation efforts for prairie dogs should be directed towards ranchers who focus on the ecological health of their land and do not believe that wildlife needs to be controlled. Now I'd like to address my third and final research question. What are the next best steps for prairie dog conservation? Based off of my research, I have 3 main recommendations. 1, raise awareness of prairie dogs. Many people I've talked with, and perhaps some of you even in this room, didn't even know what a prairie dog was. If conservationists are going to succeed, they're going to need support from the public. 2, develop an ecosystem-friendly beef certification system. An earned reward system for ecosystem-friendly ranching practices would go a long way towards reinforcing the idea that prairie dogs are good for the land, or potentially good for the ecosystem. I spoke with an organization called Certified Wildlife Friendly, and I've heard of others that are interested in developing such a certification system. And 3, determine the effects of prairie dogs on net primary productivity. The ranchers that I spoke with that focused on ecological health felt that they did so in order to increase the net primary productivity of their land. If we were able to arm ourselves with information on the effects of prairie dogs on net primary productivity, it would help to advance that conversation. I believe this research shows that there are ways to advance the conservation of prairie dogs that would be positive for ranchers. However, like all conservation efforts, it is only possible to achieve success with the necessary support. I'd like to thank my supporters, the David Schiff Fund for Wildlife, Habitat, and Environmental Research, the Berkeley Conservation Scholarship, the Carpenter Sperry Internship Fund, the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, and the Denver Zoo, and of course the Yale School of Forestry. Thank you.